Redwater Ridge was the kind of place that didn't like surprises. A dusty farming town tucked between rust-colored hills and dried-out creeks. It was a place where people said little, worked hard, and trusted only what could be held in calloused hands. And so, when a kangaroo walked into the center of town and stood completely still for nearly 30 minutes, the first reaction was denial, then silence, then unease. It was big, well over 6 feet tall, muscular, scarred, not the lean kind that bolted at the sound of tires, but something else. Its fur was thick and uneven in color, dusted in red dirt. It didn't hop. It walked, slowly, deliberately, and then stopped in the middle of the town's single roundabout, where the war memorial stood, and stared, not wildly, not nervously. It looked directly at the butcher's shop, then turned its head toward the bakery, then the post office, then the pub, one by one. By the time the local police officer, Constable Reynolds, made it down from his parked cruiser, the square was full of onlookers. They didn't come close, just stood on porches, peering from shop fronts, whispering. Someone muttered, "That's not normal." Another, "Maybe it's sick." But the animal didn't look sick. It looked focused. Then it took a step forward, and another, and walked straight toward Dennis Clay, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who ran the hardware store and was known to shoot kangaroos that wandered onto his crops. Dennis stood still. The animal stopped 4 meters away. No sound, no growl, no movement. Then, without warning, it lunged. Dennis barely had time to lift his arms before the kangaroo's legs pushed off the ground. In one swift motion, it knocked him to the ground. Not claws, just raw force. Dennis hit the dirt, dazed, wind knocked from him. And then, the kangaroo stood still again. It didn't run, didn't continue the attack. It waited. Until Dennis slowly stood, dusted himself off, and backed away. Then the kangaroo turned and returned to the center of the square. Everyone saw it. Everyone understood. It wasn't random. It was a challenge. By the third day, people started showing up early, watching from the shade, waiting to see who would be next. Because each morning the kangaroo returned, and each time it locked eyes with a new person and waited. When they approached, it stood still. When they hesitated, it stepped closer. If they accepted the silent challenge, the result was always the same. A quick, blunt impact. Never fatal, not even bloody, but enough to knock a grown man down, or leave bruises, or strip pride to the bone. Then the kangaroo would wait again, and people began to change. One man who'd spent his life hunting roosts for meat quit the job overnight. A boy who had once bragged about burning nests in the bush walked quietly into the forest and didn't return for 2 hours. When he came back, he left a pile of food outside the old water tank for the animals. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Recognition. By the 5th day, Redwater Ridge was on edge. Not because the kangaroo had attacked anyone severely, but because it hadn't left. Local news came. Cameras rolled. Someone online called it the Kangaroo Challenger. But the people in town didn't find it funny, because they knew what they had done. Years ago, before fences were replaced, before hunting was regulated, this town had been a hotbed for poaching. Kangaroos were shot, snared, gutted. Not for meat, for sport, for money, for tradition. Those things don't just disappear. They settle in the soil, in the memory of the place. And now something had come back. Not for revenge, but for a reckoning. That's when people began wondering about the list. No one knew if it was real, but the theory made sense. Each day, one person was challenged. Each night, the kangaroo vanished. And each time, the person left different. 10 had already been chosen. 3 left town entirely. Then on the 6th morning, the kangaroo returned earlier than usual. It didn't wait. It walked straight to the edge of town, toward the last house on Ridge Road, toward a wooden fence grown over with ivy, toward the porch where Jonathan Moore sat with a thermos of black tea watching the hills, 83 years old. Widower, veteran, former ranger. Some said he'd killed more roos in his time than the rest of the town combined. He didn't speak often, but when he did, people listened. And now the kangaroo stood in front of his gate, waiting, watching. That morning, no one moved. The town held its breath. And Jonathan, slowly, without a word, stood up. He poured the last of his tea into the ivy, set the cup down, and opened the gate. Then he walked toward the animal, unarmed, steady. The kangaroo didn't flinch, didn't crouch, didn't challenge. They stood face to face. 2 old survivors, one of war, one of wilderness. And then Jonathan nodded once, And the kangaroo turned and walked back toward the bush. Jonathan followed, leaving the town behind. No one tried to stop him. No one dared, because something had changed again. And this time, it wasn't the kangaroo they were afraid of. It was what he might show Jonathan. Jonathan hadn't been in that part of the forest in years. Not since his knees had started giving out on the steeper climbs. Not since his wife passed. Not since he'd given up the rifle and the traps and the quiet justifications that always followed the blood. Now he walked in silence. The kangaroo moved ahead, neither slow nor fast, just steady. It didn't look back, but never strayed too far. Jonathan didn't speak, didn't call out. The animal knew where it was going. He was just following. The bush was dry that season. Twigs cracked underfoot. The smell of dust and eucalyptus drifted through the air. Sunlight cut in shafts through the trees. Crows watched from high branches, still and silent. No one else had followed them. Jonathan glanced back once, but the ridgeline had already disappeared behind the trees. For the first time in years, he felt completely untethered. Not lost, just alone. And he welcomed it. They reached the clearing by mid-afternoon. It wasn't marked on any modern map, but Jonathan knew it the moment he saw the crooked iron stake buried in the red dirt near the center. This was one of the old sites. Back when poaching had been routine, when he and others set lines of traps in remote pockets of forest to manage the numbers. That's what they called it back then, management. But management didn't bleed, didn't cry out, didn't stare at you after you'd cracked its spine with your boot. He paused beside the iron stake. Kangaroo stopped, turned its head slightly, then walked to the edge of the clearing and sat, upright, silent, still, as if waiting. Jonathan stepped forward. The ground was scattered with fragments of wire, rusted loops, broken spring plates, half-buried metal teeth, still sharp at the edges, the remains of old traps, weathered by time, but unmistakable. He crouched slowly, grunting at the pain in his hips, and picked up one of the fragments. The serial number was still legible. He'd set this one himself 50 years ago. He ran his fingers over the cold metal, then let it fall. It landed with a dull, hollow clink, too soft for the weight it carried. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. He felt the kangaroo's presence behind him like a second shadow, silent but full of pressure. A presence that didn't accuse, didn't punish. It simply waited. That was the worst part, the waiting, because that meant it already knew. It wasn't asking for apology. It wanted something else. Jonathan rose to his feet with effort and scanned the clearing. The bones were mostly gone, long since carried off by animals or covered by wind and time, but he could still see the outlines. Flattened grass, bald patches in the soil where blood had once dried thick. He moved slowly around the edge, remembering faces, names, laughter, the way they used to joke about who'd caught the biggest roo that week, how they argued over skinning techniques like it was a sport. He remembered the boy, 15, maybe 16, who had come along once to learn the trade. The boy had cried when he saw his first kill. Jonathan hadn't comforted him. He'd just handed him a knife. The kangaroo stood now. It didn't look at him, just turned and began walking again, deeper into the trees. Jonathan hesitated. His chest was tight, not from exertion, from memory, and from shame. He followed. They reached a gully just as the sun began to tilt toward evening. This one was steeper, overgrown with scrub and wild grass. At the bottom, half hidden under leaves and dirt, was a row of newer traps. Cleaner steel, brighter springs, recently set, fresh. Jonathan froze. Someone was still doing it. The law had changed years ago. Permits revoked. Enforcement stepped up. The community had agreed, no more traps, no more blood. But someone in this town had broken the pact. The kangaroo stood at the ridge looking down. Then it looked back, and Jonathan understood. This wasn't just about the past. It was about the present, about what still lived beneath the surface. Rotting in secret, he climbed down carefully. His hands worked on their own, disarming the traps, disabling the springs, folding them closed. It came back to him quickly, like a bad habit remembered. He stacked the traps in a pile at the center of the gully. There were 10 of them. Too many, too recent. He stared at them for a long time. Then without a word, he began to dig. The soil was dry, hard-packed, but he worked slowly, steadily, using a broken branch as a spade. Sweat dripped down his neck. His back ached. The kangaroo never moved. By the time he buried the last trap, the sun was nearly gone. He wiped his hands on his shirt and sat, breathing hard. The kangaroo stepped to the edge of the pit, looked down at the mound of disturbed soil, then looked at him. For the first time, really looked. Not like an animal, like a witness. Jonathan felt the weight of it. Not hatred, not forgiveness, just truth. And it hurt more than any wound he'd ever taken. They spent the night in the gully. The air was cool. Crickets murmured in the distance. Jonathan didn't sleep much. His thoughts kept circling. Who had set those traps? Someone young? Someone old, still clinging to the past? Someone who thought no one would notice? He didn't have answers. But in the morning he would, because the time for silence had passed. The kangaroo rose with the first light. So did Jonathan. And together they climbed back toward the town. Jonathan returned just after sunrise, alone. The kangaroo had stopped at the tree line and watched him walk the last 100 meters down Ridge Road, that same straight stretch the kids used to race their bikes along. No one saw it leave. No one saw it stay. But by the time Jonathan reached the main street, people were already waiting. Some leaned against door frames. Others sat in utes with windows down. A few pretended not to look but followed every step through half-shut blinds. He didn't speak, just walked, steady, grim, covered in dust. At the general store, Maggie Cook stepped out onto the footpath. She looked him up and down, then quietly asked, "Was it you?" Jonathan stopped, looked at her. "No," he said, "but it could have been." He didn't say anything else, just kept walking. By mid-morning, the rumors had outpaced him. Jonathan followed it into the bush. He found a graveyard out there. He buried something. No, he found someone setting new traps. No, he was the one setting them. The town buzzed like a fence about to spark. Redwater Ridge had always lived on unspoken rule, what to talk about and what to let sink into the dust. But the kangaroo had shattered that. Now every silence felt suspicious. Every man who had once carried a rifle looked like he was hiding something. And everyone knew someone had broken the pact. Years ago, after the fines came down and the government sent in the surveyors, the townspeople had stood together. No more traps, no more night hunts, no more off-the-record culling. It hadn't been about guilt, it had been about survival. The world was watching, and they had sworn to change. Now that oath had been cracked, and the kangaroo somehow knew. By noon, Jonathan sat in the fire station meeting room, staring at a bottle of warm water and an old map on the wall. He had asked for a quiet space. He hadn't asked for company. But they came anyway. First was Al Marsh, ex-councilman, big voice, always smelled like old rope and oil. "What are you trying to do?" Al asked. "Turn the whole bloody town against itself?" "No," Jonathan said. "I'm trying to figure out who's still living like it's 1973. Al's jaw tightened. "You of all people don't get to talk about that." Jonathan didn't look up. "That's exactly why I do." Then came Miriam and Theo, mother and teenage son. It was Theo who had started the rumor. Traps in the bush. His friends laughed at him, said he'd made it up. But when Jonathan nodded once, just slightly, the room went quiet. "You saw them?" Miriam asked. "Yes." "Fresh?" "Yes." Theo looked pale. "I told them I wasn't lying. I told them." Jonathan held up a hand. "It's not about proving you were right," he said. "It's about what we do now." The town meeting was called for 6 p.m. They gathered in the hall with the old wooden floor and the uneven fluorescent lights. About 50 people came, some out of curiosity, some out of fear, a few out of guilt. The mayor, Glenn Harris, stood up first. He was only in his second year. New blood, clean image, a handshake that came with a press release. "We don't know what this is," he began. "A freak animal, maybe, a trained one. Someone's idea of a joke. But I think we can all agree, it's caused tension. From the back, it's caused questions." That was Maggie. She stood now too. "Questions we've ignored for too long." Glenn's face tightened. "Let's not spiral into blame." "No one's blaming," she said, "but someone's still setting traps." A murmur swept through the room. Someone else added, "Maybe more than one." Then Theo's voice. "I saw one behind the quarry. Last month." Now it wasn't murmurs, it was whispers. Accusations under breath, eyes darting, people shifting in chairs. Then silence. And then Jonathan stood. Slowly, no notes, no speech, just words. "I walked with that animal. Not because I wanted to, because it gave me no choice. I think it knew who I was, what I'd done, or not done." He let the weight of that hang. "I saw the clearing," he continued, "and a gully, full of new traps. Someone here is still doing it. And whoever it is, you're dragging all of us back into the dark." No one moved. He looked around, not accusing, just searching. "If you're setting traps, say it. Now, not to be punished, but to be seen, so we can stop it. Together." Nothing. Just the hum of the old ceiling fan. Jonathan nodded once, stepped down and sat. No one came forward. The meeting ended in tension. No closure, no confession. But a crack had opened. And in small towns, cracks don't close. They spread. That night, someone left a bundle of wire outside Jonathan's gate. Old, rusted, coiled tight. A note on top, "I'm sorry, I didn't know what else to do." No name. But that was the beginning. The next morning, 2 more bundles appeared. One at the town hall steps, another near the school. No notes this time, just wire. Tangled proof of guilt. Over the next 3 days, 12 traps were turned in. Quietly, anonymously. No one asked where they came from. No one had to. The kangaroo didn't return. But its absence was louder than its presence. People still walked differently through town. Still looked up at the ridge line with expectation. Still hesitated before taking the first step into the bush. And somewhere beneath all that silence, the ground was shifting. Something had been buried too long. Now it was rising. And this time, they had to face it. Together. It started with a map. Jonathan spread it across the table in the community shed. The same shed where they once held barbecues and auctions, and years ago used to dry animal skins on metal hooks by the wall. Now the hooks were gone, but the memories lingered. The map was old, creased, smudged with time and dirt, but it still held the shape of the land. Ridges, creeks, fences, scrub zone. Some of the names had faded, but Jonathan didn't need them. He remembered every trail by feel. He circled the clearing, the gully, the old trap lines. Then he drew a rough boundary around it all. A jagged, uneven shape. Beside it, he wrote one word: protected. He didn't go door to door. He didn't make speeches. He left the map taped to the window of the general store with a note that read, "The land remembers. Maybe we should too. If you want this to mean something, meet me here, Saturday, 5 p.m. That was it. No slogans, no guilt, no names. But the note stirred something. Maybe because people were tired of pretending nothing had happened. Or maybe because the kangaroo hadn't come back, and they felt they owed it an answer. When Saturday came, 21 people showed up. Some in work boots, some in old R.M. Williams hats, some with kids who didn't understand what they were walking toward, only that their parents were quieter than usual. Jonathan brought only 2 things, a rake and a pair of gloves. He didn't speak. He just started clearing the old path. Branches, bottles, rusted cans, bits of fence. Others joined him. First Theodore, then Miriam, then Alistair, the ex-councilman who used to fight everything. Within an hour, the trail to the clearing was open for the first time in years. By sunset, they had marked a rough perimeter with stones. Not legal, not official, but real. A line drawn not in ink but in sweat. The next day, the backlash began. Flyers appeared overnight. "This isn't a zoo. Don't let old men rewrite history. Redwater Ridge needs roads, not sanctuaries." Some said it was the council, others said teenagers. But Jonathan knew better. This wasn't about policy. It was about fear. People were afraid of what would happen if they admitted something was wrong. Because once you admit that, you have to do something about it. On Monday, the mayor called for a vote. Official recognition of a wildlife reserve on community land. The idea split the town down the middle. The pro side said it was time. The opposition said it was performative, a way for people to feel good without fixing anything. Jonathan stood near the back during the meeting, listening. He didn't speak until the end. And then only 6 words. "We owe more than we think." He didn't elaborate, didn't plead, just left the room. The motion passed by 2 votes. It wasn't much, but it was something. The clearing became a work site. Volunteers brought wood for signs. Theo and his mates carried stones for trail markers. Miriam painted a small bench green and white and carved a message on it. Not all wounds bleed, some grow back. Even the ones who had voted against the reserve began to drift in. Not to help, but to watch. To sit quietly at the edge and drink their coffee, eyes on the tree line. The kangaroo didn't return, but its absence still held weight, as if it were giving them time, or waiting to see what they would choose to be. One afternoon, a stranger came. A young woman in hiking gear, with a faded notepad and a camera slung over her shoulder. She said she was writing about rural conservation efforts, asked permission to walk the boundary. Jonathan agreed. They walked in silence most of the way, but as they passed the gully, she slowed. "Is this where it happened?" she asked. Jonathan nodded. She crouched beside the burial site, the one where he had laid the traps to rest, and placed her hand on the mound. "I've covered rewilding projects all over the country," she said, "but I've never heard of something like this starting with a kangaroo." "It didn't start with him," Jonathan said. "It started with us. He just made it visible." She didn't ask for a quote. She didn't need one. Later that week, a boy from the next town over found a trapped wallaby caught in a snare near a service road. Not fresh, not clean. It died before the rangers got there. The story made local radio, then regional. And suddenly, Redwater Ridge wasn't just that place with the kangaroo. It was the place that did something. Teachers started bringing students. Rangers came to inspect and advise. Locals who once mocked the project began volunteering, quietly, anonymously, but consistently. And slowly, the idea spread. Maybe small places can lead. On the first anniversary, they held a gathering. No speeches, no cameras, just people. They cleared the trail again, repainted the bench, cleaned the signs. And one by one, they laid small stones at the edge of the clearing, each with a word carved into it. Hope, change, sorry, enough. Still, begin. No one told them to do it. It just happened. Like the land was asking for something soft, something honest. And they listened. That night, as the last of the volunteers packed up and the moon rose over the ridge, someone pointed to the tree line. A shape moved between the trees. Broad-shouldered, tall, still, no sound, no approach, no retreat. Just presence, a pause, then gone. No one chased it. No one needed to. Because whether it was the same kangaroo or not didn't matter. The message had already been delivered. And this time, they'd heard it. 3 years had passed. Redwater Ridge was no longer just a town on the map. It had become a story. The kind that spread slowly, word by word, across communities, classrooms, campfires. The kind told without headlines. The kind people remembered. It wasn't the kangaroo that people talked about most. It was what happened after. By the time the reserve was officially recognized by the Department of Environment, the clearing had been renamed the Ridgeline Refuge. Students came from cities to walk the trail. Rangers came to train volunteers in wildlife monitoring. Even the council, which had once dismissed it as nostalgic indulgence, now called it a community-led model for ecological healing. But for the people who had been there from the beginning, it wasn't about awards or press releases. It was about remembering and choosing every day to keep listening. Jonathan was still alive. He didn't lead anymore. His body wouldn't let him. But every morning he sat on the bench with the green and white paint under Miriam's inscription. He watched the path. He spoke little. Sometimes children asked him questions. Sometimes he just nodded. One day, Theo, now 17, lankier, quieter, sat beside him. "Do you think it's the same one?" he asked. Jonathan looked up. "The kangaroo?" "Well, yeah. I don't know," Jonathan said. "Maybe it never mattered." Every year on the same week the kangaroo had first appeared, the town held what they now called the Circle. It wasn't a festival. No food trucks, no rides. Just people. At dawn, they gathered at the reserve. They stood in silence. Then one by one, they stepped into the center of the old clearing, where the soil still held the memory of traps and ash. Each person stood alone for a moment, then stepped out. That was it. No one was told what to feel. No one was graded or judged. But each year more came. The fourth circle was different. It rained. A quiet, steady rain that soaked clothes and softened the ground. But people still came. Theo stood at the center with wet hair sticking to his forehead. He held something in his hand, an old piece of wire twisted into a spiral, a shape he had found behind his grandfather's shed, buried beneath decades of grass. He laid it at the foot of a tree and walked out of the ring. Later, he would say nothing about it, but he stopped hunting rabbits after that. Even when no one asked him to, media attention returned briefly that year. An independent filmmaker came to shoot a documentary called The Day Nobody Fought. He interviewed locals, filmed quiet walks through the trees, caught the wind moving through the tall grass on the ridge. But the footage that stayed with people was of the townsfolk simply standing together, silent, still, eyes closed. Not for mourning, not for performance, for presence. The film never aired on television, but it was passed between schools and community centers and land management groups. It became a quiet kind of tool, not to teach, but to ask. What would you do if something looked you in the eyes and waited? A year later, a new teacher came to the local school. Mid-20s, full of energy. She introduced a new module on conservation history, gave the students a project, Find one person in this town who made a change. Tell their story. One boy picked Jonathan. He brought in a photo. Jonathan beside the bench, hands folded on his cane, eyes closed. He said he didn't yell, he just did something. And everyone saw. Another girl chose Theo. She said he used to catch lizards in his lunchbox. Now he's planting trees. Others picked Miriam, Maggie, even Alistair. Some picked the kangaroo. I know it's not a person, one kid said, but it started it. Nobody disagreed. At the next circle, the rain returned. So did something else. Not a kangaroo, not a sign, just a pause. A long stillness that settled over the clearing like a held breath. Birds stopped singing. The wind froze in the trees. And for a moment, brief, invisible, unmistakable, it felt like someone was watching. Not in threat, not in judgment, but with a kind of approval. No one said it aloud. But afterward, Theo looked at Jonathan and asked, "Did you feel that?" Jonathan smiled and nodded. The reserve kept growing, not in size, in memory. Families brought ashes to scatter. Artists painted wooden posts with animal tracks. A local carpenter carved a spiral into every new bench he built. And the children, the ones too young to remember the first years, began playing games called circle walks and silent talks. They didn't know what the games meant. Not yet, but they would. One evening, just before dark, a young roost stood at the edge of the clearing. Still, tall, alone. It didn't come close, didn't challenge anyone, just stood there. And someone, no one knew who, whispered, "Ah, thank you." The kangaroo turned and bounded away. In time, people forgot the date of the first challenge, forgot who was the third to fight or the ninth. But they remembered the feeling, the weight in the chest, the quiet before change, the dignity of not looking away. And the lesson that stuck deeper than any law: respect doesn't come from fear. It comes from standing still and choosing not to harm.